The Urantia book, section 3, the history of Urantia, paper 89, sin, sacrifice and atonement. Alright, primitive man regarded himself as being in debt to the spirits, as standing in need of redemption. So now we get a deeper understanding where this whole idea of redemption is coming from. It all comes from primitive man regarded himself as being in debt to the spirits and thus in a standing need of redemption. As the savages looked at it, injustice, the spirits might have visited much more bad luck upon them. As time passed, this concept developed into the doctrine of sin and salvation. So this whole idea of sin and salvation is a man-created doctrine stemming directly out of ghost fear. The soul was looked upon as coming into the world under forfeit - original sin. The soul must be ransomed. And how many people are saying that Jesus has ransomed them free? Which is actually coming from Paul, who speaks these, who has spoken these words. Jesus didn't ransom us free. And then point comma, a scapegoat must be provided. A scapegoat must be provided. Ain't it written in the Torah about two goats? One offered for the sins of the people and the other was taken into the wild. And on the other, the priests had laid their hands on and transferred all the sins of the people on it. And that goat was a scapegoat actually, and was representing, what was it? Well, sort of Satan-like figure. And that goat was sent directly to the one who brought the tribe or clan into sin. And so that goat was taken into the wild and let go of. Now we know where all this nonsense is coming from. It's all coming from and based in ghost fear. Because the head hunter, in addition to practicing the cult of skull worship, was able to provide a substitute for his own life, a scapeman. The savage was early possessed with the notion that spirits derive supreme satisfaction from the sight of human misery, suffering and humiliation. At first, man was only concerned with sins of commission. But later he became exercised over sins of omission. And the whole subsequent sacrificial system grew up around these two ideas. This new ritual had to do with the observance of the propitiation ceremonies of sacrifice. Primitive man believed that something special must be done to win the favor of the so-called gods. Only advanced civilization recognizes a consistently even, tempered and benevolent God. Propitiation was insurance against immediate ill luck rather than investment in future bliss, and the rituals of avoidance, exorcism, coercion and propitiation all merge into one another. 1. The taboo. Observance of a taboo was a man's effort to dodge ill luck, to keep from offending the spirit ghosts by the avoidance of something. The taboos were at first non-religious, but they early acquired ghost or spirit sanction, and when thus reinforced, they became lawmakers and institution builders. So here we get the background of how institution came on the scene and how lawmakers came into existence. The taboo is the source of ceremonial standards and the ancestor of primitive self-control. It was the earliest form of societal regulation, and for a long time the only one. It is still a basic unit of the social regulative structure. The respect which these prohibitions commanded in the mind of the savage exactly equaled his fear of the powers who were supposed to enforce them. Taboos first arose because of chance experience with ill luck. Later they were proposed by chiefs and shamans, fetish men who were thought to be directed by a spirit ghost, even by a so-called god. The fear of spirit retribution is so great in the mind of a primitive that he sometimes dies of fright when he has violated a taboo, and this dramatic episode enormously strengthens the hold of the taboo on the minds of the survivors. Among the earliest prohibitions were restrictions on the appropriation of women and other property. As religion began to play a larger part in evolution of the taboo, the article resting under ban was regarded as unclean, subsequently as unholy. The records of the Hebrews are full of the mention of things clean and unclean, holy and unholy. But their beliefs along these lines were far less cumbersome and extensive than were those of many other peoples. The 7 commandments of Dalmatia and Eden, as well as the 10 injunctions of the Hebrews, were definite taboos, all expressed in the same negative form as were the most ancient prohibitions. But these newer codes were truly emancipating in that they took the place of thousands of pre-existent taboos, and more than this, these later commandments definitely promised something in return for obedience. The early food taboos originated in fetishism and totemism. The swine was sacred to the Phoenicians. The cow is sacred to the Hindus. The Egyptian taboo on pork has been perpetuated by the Hebraic and Islamic faiths. A variant of the food taboo was the belief that a pregnant woman could think so much about a certain food that the child, when born, would be the echo of that food. Such viands would be taboo to the child. Methods of eating soon became taboo, and so originated ancient and modern table etiquette. Caste systems and social levels are vestigial remnants of olden prohibitions. The taboos were highly effective in organizing society, but they were terribly burdensome. The negative ban system not only maintained useful and constructive regulations, but also obsolete, outworn, and useless taboos. There would, however, be no civilized society to sit in criticism upon primitive men except for these far-flung and multifarious taboos, and the taboo would never have endured but for the upholding sanctions of primitive religion. Many of the essential factors in man's evolution have been highly expensive, have cost vast treasure in effort, sacrifice, and self-denial. But these achievements of self-control were the real rungs on which man climbed civilization's ascending ladder. The concept of sin. Point 2. The fear of chance and the dread of bad luck literally drove man into the invention of primitive religion as supposed insurance against these calamities. From magic and ghosts, religion evolved through spirits and fetishes to taboos. Every primitive tribe had its tree of forbidden fruit. Each and every primitive tribe had its tree of forbidden fruit, literally the apple, but figuratively consisting of 1,000 branches hanging heavy with all sorts of taboos. And the forbidden tree always said, "Thou shalt not." As the savage mind evolved to that point where it emphasized both good and bad spirits, and when the taboo received the solemn sanction of evolving religion, the stage was all set for the appearance of the new conception of sin. The idea of sin was universally established in the world before revealed religion ever made its entry. It was only by the concept of sin that natural death became logical to the primitive mind. Sin was the transgression of taboo, and death was the penalty of sin. Sin was ritual, not rational, an act, not a thought, and this entire concept of sin was fostered by the lingering traditions of Dilmun. And Dilmun is a place where the descendants of the Nodites came to live, and where they started their arcu in building the Tower of Bablot, which later became better known as Babel. Ba, ba, ba. And the days of a little paradise on earth, the tradition of Adam and the Garden of Eden also lent substance to the dream of a one-time, between quotation marks, golden age of the dawn of the races, and all stands to the dream of a one-time golden age. So-called golden age of the dawn of the races, and all this confirmed the ideas later expressed in the belief that man had his origin in a special creation, that he started his career in perfection, and that transgression of the taboos sin brought him down to his later sorry plight. To those who believed that prosperity and righteousness went together, the apparent prosperity of the wicked occasioned so much worry that it was necessary to invent hells for the punishment of taboo violators. Hell is a human concept coming from the primitive human, not God. God never made a hell. Why should he? Why should you, as creator of your own human children, send your own human children, your own creation, into a world, into a realm, into something that is called hell? That doesn't make any sense. And that's the whole problem. The majority of human races has lost their common sense. Due to the impoverished education, so-called education system. So that it was necessary to invent hells for the punishment of taboo violators. The numbers of these places of future punishment have varied from 1 to 5. The idea of confession and forgiveness early appeared in primitive religion. Men would ask forgiveness at a public meeting for sins they intended to commit. What is a sin? Sin is actually an act that you deliberately and consciously do against the universe and thus against God, the Creator. But it's something you do with a reason, you do it consciously, and you do it to gain some selfish profit from it. So the idea of confession and forgiveness came and appeared in early primitive religion. Men would ask forgiveness at a public meeting for sins they intended to commit. So in early days, people were already asking for forgiveness for something that they were about to commit. The following week, for example, confession was merely a rite of remission, also a public notification of defilement, a ritual of crying, between quotation marks, unclean, unclean. Then followed all the ritualistic schemes of purification. All ancient peoples practiced these meaningless ceremonies. Many apparently hygienic customs of the early tribes were largely ceremonial. And then point 3, renunciation and humiliation. Renunciation came as the next step in religious evolution. Fasting was a common practice. So it was a common practice to torture your soul and to torture your body. Soon it became the custom to forego many forms of physical pleasure, especially of a sexual nature. So there is the existence of sexual orgies. The ritual of the ritual of the fast was deeply rooted in many ancient religions and has been handed down to practically all modern theologic systems of thought. Just about the time barbarian man was recovering from the wasteful practice of burning and burying property with the dead, just as the economic structure of the races was beginning to take shape, this new religious doctrine of renunciation appeared, and tens of thousands of earnest souls began to court poverty. Property was regarded as a spiritual handicap. Here is the root basis laid for this idea of tiny houses, but also is in this laid the root of undoing yourselves from material and materialism. There is nothing wrong with material goods, but it's not. It becomes something different when you are having your life completely focused on it, and then undo yourselves from spiritual growth. There's a lot of people, this whole tiny house movement and so on is actually based on this fundament of not allowing to have too much material goods around you. What I say, it's okay to have material goods around you because in some way, shape or form it serves you on your path of evolution and growth, but it becomes different if you are only focused on material things. If your life is only in service to gain material goods, and when you are avoiding and rejecting spiritual growth and the spiritual element in your life and of your life, then material goods then become a prison for your soul. These notions of the spiritual dangers of material possession were widely entertained in the times of Philo and Paul, or Philo and Paul. And they have markedly influenced European philosophy ever since. So it's interesting to know how Paul of Tarsus has such an influence and had such an influence in early days and still has an influence on the peoples of today. But that influence is not always so very good for us. And they have markedly influenced European philosophy ever since. Poverty was just a part of the ritual of the mortification of the flesh, which unfortunately became incorporated into the writings and teachings of many religions, notably Christianity. Penance is the negative form of this oftentimes foolish ritual of renunciation. But all this taught the savage so-called self-control, and that was a worthwhile advancement in social evolution. Self-denial and self-control were two of the greatest social gains from early evolutionary religion. Self-control gave man a new philosophy of life. It taught him the art of augmenting life's fraction by lowering the denominator of personal demands instead of always attempting to increase the numerator of selfish gratification. These olden ideas of self-discipline embraced flogging and all sorts of physical torture, because it is all physical torture, but also torture of your soul. The priests of the mother cult were especially active in teaching the virtue of physical suffering, setting the example by submitting themselves to castration. The Hebrews, Hindus, and Buddhists were earnest devotees of this doctrine of physical humiliation. All through the olden times, when men sought in these ways for extra credits on the self-denial ledgers of their so-called gods, it was once customary, when under some emotional stress, to make vows of self-denial and self-torture. In times, these vows assumed the form of contracts with the so-called gods, and in that sense represented true evolutionary progress, in that the so-called gods were supposed to do something definite in return for this self-torture and mortification of the flesh and soul. Vows were both negative and positive. Pledges of this harmful and extreme nature are best observed today among certain groups in India. It was only natural that the cult of renunciation and humiliation should have paid attention to sexual gratification. In later days, it became the practice of, between quotation marks, saints. This cult tolerated marriage only as an evil lesser than fornication. Many of the world's great religions have been adversely influenced by this ancient cult, but none more markedly than Christianity. The Apostle Paul was a devotee of this cult. So that gives another picture on this Apostle Paul. This cult led Paul to look down upon women, and the pity of it all is that his personal opinions have long influenced the teachings of a great world religion. If the advice of the tent maker / teacher were to be literally and universally obeyed, then would the human race, with the ancient continence cult, then would the human race come to a sudden and inglorious end. Oh wait, If the advice of this tent maker slash teacher were to be literally and universally obeyed, then would the human race come to a sudden and inglorious end. Furthermore, the involvement of a religion with the ancient continent's cult leads directly to a war against marriage and the home, society's veritable foundation and the basic institution of human progress. And it is not to be wondered at that all such beliefs fostered the formation of celibate priesthoods in the many religions of various peoples. Origins of sacrifice. Sacrifice as a part of religious devotions, like many other worshipful rituals, did not have a simple and single origin. In the following of the dog before its master, it is but one step from the impulse of worship to the act of sacrifice. Primitive man gauged the value of his sacrifice by the pain which he suffered when the idea of sacrifice first attached itself to religious ceremonial. No offering was contemplated which was not productive of pain. The first sacrifices were such acts as plucking hair, cutting the flesh, mutilations, knocking out teeth, and cutting off fingers. As civilization so-called advanced, these crude concepts of sacrifice were elevated to the level of the ritual of self-abnegations, asceticism, fasting. So fasting is nothing more than torture of the body and the soul. Deprivation and the later Christian doctrine of sanctification through sorrow, suffering, and mortification of the flesh. And the debt sacrifice, which embraced the idea of redemption, later became developed into the notion of substitution. So early in the evolution of religion, there existed two conceptions of the sacrifice. One, the idea of the gift sacrifice, which connoted the attitude of thanksgiving, and the debt sacrifice, which embraced the idea of redemption. Later, there developed the notion of substitution. Okay. Gifts and bribes are given to men, but when tendered to the so-called gods, they are described as being dedicated, made sacred, or are called sacrifices. Renunciation was the negative form of propitiation. Sacrifice became the positive form. The act of propitiation included praise, glorification, flattery, and even entertainment, and it is the remnants of these positive practices of the olden propitiation cult that constitute the modern forms of divine worship. Present-day forms of worship are nothing more than simply the realization of these ancient sacrificial techniques of positive propitiation. It was no empty boast that a certain Egyptian ruler made when he stated that he had sacrificed 1,433 slaves for 4,093 386 head of cattle, 88 boats, 2,756 golden images, 331,702 jars of honey and oil, and so on. Well, this is all coming from the Bible. And then 228,380 jars of wine, 680,740 geese, and 6,744,428 loaves of bread, and 5,740,352 sacks of corn. And in order to do this, he must needs have sorely taxed his toiling subjects. Sheer necessities eventually drove these semi-savages to eat the material part of their sacrifices, the so-called gods having enjoyed the so-called soul thereof. And this custom found justification under the pretense of the ancient sacred meal, a communion service according to modern usage. Point 5. Sacrifices and cannibalism. Modern ideas in early cannibalism are entirely wrong. It was a part of the mores of early society. While cannibalism is traditionally horrible to modern civilization, it was a part of the social and religious structure of primitive society. Group interests dedicated the practice of cannibalism. It grew up through the urge of necessity and persisted because of the slavery of superstition and ignorance. It was a social, economic, religious, and military custom. Among some tribes, aged parents would seek to be eaten by their children. Among others, it was customary to refrain from eating near relations. Their bodies were sold or exchanged for those of strangers. There was considerable commerce in women and children who had been fattened for slaughter. Here comes the Hans and Gretel story from. When disease or war failed to control population, the surplus was unceremoniously eaten. Cannibalism has been gradually disappearing because of the following influences. 1. It sometimes became a communal ceremony, the assumption of collective responsibility for inflicting the death penalty upon a fellow tribesman. 2. It very early became a religious ritual, but the growth of ghost fear did not always operate to reduce man-eating. 3. Eventually it progressed to the point where only certain parts or organs of the body were eaten, those parts supposed to contain the soul or portions of. The spirit blood drinking became common, and it was customary to mix the, between quotation marks, edible parts of the body with medicines. 4. It became limited to men. Women were forbidden to eat human flesh. And 5. It was next limited to the chiefs, priests, and shamans. And 6. Then it became taboo among the higher tribes. The taboo on man-eating originated in Dalmatia and slowly spread over the world. So the Nodites encouraged cremation as a means of combating cannibalism. So now we know why also cremation is being done, to combat cannibalism. Since it was once a common practice to dig up buried bodies and to eat them. And 7, human sacrifice sounded the death knell of cannibalism. Human flesh have become the food of superior men, the chiefs. It was eventually reserved for the still more superior spirits, and thus the offering of human sacrifices effectively put a stop to cannibalism, except among the lowest tribes. When human sacrifice was fully established, man-eating became taboo. Human flesh was a food only for the gods. Man could eat only a small ceremonial bit, a sacrament. So now we also get the deeper understanding from where the sacrament comes from. Well, finally, animal substitutes came into general use for sacrificial purposes, and even among the more backward tribes, dog eating greatly reduced man eating. The dog was the first domesticated animal and was held in high esteem, both as such and as food. And this is still being done in China, because the Chinese people, the majority, especially those in cities, are eating still dog meat, and also other meat from other animals such as cats, and they do horrific things before the cat dies or the dog dies. They throw them in very hot temperatured bath, water, alive. They don't kill the dog before. No, they put it alive in tremendous upheated water. So you do not want to know the screaming of such animal. Humanity is still primitive. Humanity thinks it is very advanced, but it's in actuality not. In the majority of regions here on Earth, a lot of humans are still practicing primitiveness. What I say, in China they eat cats, dogs and other things that can be eaten. This is all based on primitivism. There are many tribes, and also in the so-called civilized Western world, which is absolutely not civilized at all, they are still practicing primitivism. Human sacrifice has been virtually universal. It persisted in the religious customs of the Chinese, Hindus, Egyptians, Hebrews, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Romans and many other peoples, even onto the recent times among the backward African and Australian tribes. The later American Indians had a civilization emerging from cannibalism and therefore steeped in human sacrifice, especially in Central and South America. The Chaldeans were among the first to abandon the sacrificing of humans for ordinary occasions, substituting therefore animals. About 2000 years ago, a tender-hearted Japanese emperor introduced clay images to take the place of human sacrifices. But it was less than 1,000 years ago that these sacrifices died out in Northern Europe. Men and women became very addicted to making foolish and needless vows, and the men of old held all such pledges to be highly sacred. And here a small thing. A petty king in Palestine, in building the walls of Jericho, laid the foundation thereof in Abiram, his firstborn, and set up the gates therefore in his youngest son Segub. At that late date, not only did the father put 2 of his sons alive in the foundation holes of the city gates, but his action is also recorded as being according to the word of the Lord, which of course is not true, but humanity does everything better said, humanity in early days was hanging everything to God. But God didn't do, of course, such a things, and never demanded his children to do such horrific things. Moses had forbidden these foundation sacrifices, but the Israelites reverted to them soon after his death. The 20th century ceremony of depositing trinkets and keepsakes in the cornerstone of a new building is reminiscent of the primitive foundation sacrifices, and people were also burned alive. It was also part of this sacrifice. All right, and of course it was for a long time very normal to dedicate the first fruits to the spirits, which means your firstborns. And these observances, now more or less symbolic, are all survivals of the early ceremonies involving human sacrifice. The idea of offering the firstborn as a sacrifice was widespread among the ancients, especially among the Phoenicians, who were the last to give it up. It used to be said, upon sacrificing life for life. Now you say, at death, dust to dust. The spectacle of Abraham constrained to sacrifice his son Isaac will, shocking to civilized susceptibilities, was not a new or strange idea to the men of those days. Modifications of human sacrifice. Moses attempted to end human sacrifices by inaugurating the ransom as a substitute. And then a short piece about this. He established a systematic schedule which enabled his people to escape the worst results of their rash and foolish vows. Lands, properties, and children could be redeemed according to the established, which were payable to the priests. And of course, we also have had in ancient times groups that seed the ritual killing of children. It was the custom to put an infant away by itself, off in the wilderness or in a little boat on the water. If the child survived, it was thought that the so-called gods had intervened to preserve him, as in the traditions of Sargon, Moses, Cyrus, and Romulus. All were placed in baskets on a river, sending out your children into the wild. Okay. Temple harlotry eventually spread throughout Southern Europe and Asia. The money earned by the temple prostitutes was held sacred among all peoples, and was a high gift to present to the so-called gods. Many of the better classes of women collected their dowries by temporary sex service in the temples, and most men prefer to have such women for wives. Point 8. Redemption and covenants. Sacrificial redemption and temple prostitution were in reality modifications of human sacrifice. This ceremony consisted in bloodshedding with dedication to lifelong virginity, and was a moral reaction to the older temple harlotry. Shaving the head and cutting the hair were likewise forms of religious devotion. The making of eunuchs was at first a modification of the idea of human sacrifice. Nose and lip piercing is still practiced in Africa, and tattooing is an artistic evolution of the earlier crude scarring of the body. And actually tattooing yourself is not necessary anymore. It is a torture of the body, and you should not do so because the body is the temple of God. And we are actually, better said, we need to make sure that the body stays clean and that the temple stays undamaged and clean. So if you have this idea to tattooage yourself with something, you need to ask yourself, why are you doing this, and whom is whispering this into your ear to do such a torture to the body? Man could never even dream entering into a contract with deity until his concept of the one true living God had advanced to the level whereon the universe controllers were envisioned as dependable. But the idea of making a covenant with the so-called gods did finally arrive. Of a better said, with the gods, and the gods mentioned here are God the Father, the Eternal Son, and the Infinite Spirit. Evolutionary man eventually acquired such moral dignity that he dared to bargain with his so-called with his gods. So with the one true living God, the Eternal Son, and the Infinite Spirit. And so the business of offering sacrifices gradually developed into the game of man's philosophic bargaining with God. And as a last, early prayer was hardly worship, it was a bargaining petition for health, wealth, and life. So here we speak about the existence of prosperity gospel. And in many respects, prayers have not much changed with the passing of the ages. They are still read out of books, recited formally, and written out for emplacement on wheels and for hanging on trees, where the blowing of the wind will save man the trouble of expending his own breath. And this is what we see in cultures such as the Asian cultures, Tibetan Buddhism and so on, where they have these flags with religious texts on it and so on. Point 9, sacrifices and sacraments. We already have spoken about that. The human sacrifice throughout the course of evolution of Urantian rituals has advanced from the bloody business of man-eating to higher and more symbolic levels. The early rituals of sacrifice bred the later ceremonies of sacrament. In more recent times, the priest alone would partake of a bit of the cannibalistic sacrifice or a drop of human blood. And then all would partake of the animal substitute. These early ideas of ransom, redemption, and covenants have evolved into the later day sacramental services, and all this ceremonial evolution has exerted a mighty socializing influence in connection with the so-called Mother of God cult in Mexico and elsewhere, a sacrament of cakes and wine was eventually utilized in lieu of the flesh and blood of the older human sacrifices. The Hebrews long practiced this ritual as a part of their Passover ceremonies, and it was from this ceremonial that the later Christian version of the sacrament took its origin. So the ancient social brotherhoods were based on the rite of blood drinking. The early Jews' fraternity was a sacrificial blood affair. Paul started out to build the early Jewish fraternity. Paul started out to build a new Christian cult on the, between quotation marks, the blood of the everlasting covenant. And while he may have unnecessarily encumbered Christianity with teachings about blood and sacrifice, he did once and for all make an end of the doctrines of redemption through human or animal sacrifices. His theologic comprises indicate that even revelation must submit to the graduated control of evolution. According to Paul, Christ became the last and all-sufficient human sacrifice. The divine judge is now fully and forever satisfied. And as last, thus are the sacraments of modern religions the legitimate successors of those shocking early ceremonies of human sacrifices and the still earlier cannibalistic rituals. Many still depend upon blood for salvation, but it has at least become figurative, symbolic and mystic. And as last, point 10, forgiveness of sin. Sin must be redefined as deliberate disloyalty to the one true living God, and so to the universe. There are degrees of disloyalty: the partial loyalty of indecision, the divided loyalty of conflicting, the dying loyalty of indifference, and the death of loyalty exhibited in devotion to godless ideals. The confession of sin is a manful repudiation of disloyalty, but it in no wise mitigates the time-space consequences of such disloyalty. But confession, sincere recognition of the nature of sin, is essential to religious growth and spiritual progress. So confession is good as long as it is really done from the idea really to have yourselves grown into new spiritual progress and spiritual levels of understanding life and yourself and soul progression. The forgiveness of sin by deity is the renewal of loyalty relations following a period of the human consciousness of the lapse of such relations as the consequences of conscious rebellion. The forgiveness does not have to be sought, only received as the consciousness of re-establishment of loyalty, relations between the creature and the Creator, and all the loyal sons of the one true living God are happy and service-loving and ever progressive in the paradise ascent, because that is why you are here on earth. You are born here to explore what it is to be a mortal and what it is to live a mortal life. You are here to go through your first step of ascension, and to go also through a decision if you truly want to save your soul and go for the long ascension path that will bring you eventually to the central universe, where paradise is and where the one true living God resides, as well as the eternal Son and the infinite Spirit and the Paradise Creator Sons and other Paradise Creator Sons groups. And with this said, I have come to the reading of paper 89, and all the information presented in this paper came from a brilliant evening star of Nebadon. And thank you so much, brilliant evening star of Nebadon, for this information. And I want to say as last, thank you all for listening to this audio video, and God bless you.